So these networks filled a critical gap during the period where we really had no official intelligence services that were assigned the responsibilities to defend the republic against enemies, foreign and domestic. And this is just one sort of snapshot of the kinds of networks and institutions that were formed to fill that vacuum until we really reached the point as a sovereign nation where we felt the necessity and the confidence to establish permanent institutions, military and intelligence-wise, that would not jeopardize the existence of our democratic federal republic.
Good evening, everyone, and welcome. I'm John Fenzel, and this is the Heroes Path webinar. A quick word about what Heroes Path is all about. For anyone joining us for the first time, we tell stories of people who did the hard, often invisible right thing under pressures. There are stories about character and about commitment and courage. And tonight's story is one of my favorites because it's about a handful of private citizens who quietly held the line for a young republic when the government had decided that it could at that point. So 2 housekeeping notes as we go into this. We are recording tonight, and so if you have to drop off, you'll get the replay. Please use the Q&A panel throughout. Drop your questions in the chat as they come to you, and we'll get to as many of those as we possibly can. But this is part 2 of our series, The Untold Story of U.S. Intelligence. And here's the puzzle at the heart of it tonight. After the Revolutionary War, the United States did something absolutely remarkable and on its face, almost reckless. It demanded the very intelligence networks that had just won the war. And this was a deep fear that spies and standing armies were the machinery of monarchy and that new republicans wanted no part of it. Britain and the great powers of Europe had not given up breaking America apart. And the War of 1812 was the reminder of that. So the question is, who filled that vacuum? And the answer turned out to be a set of semi-private institutions and some names you know for entirely different reasons. Names like James Fenimore Cooper, Samuel Morse, Lafayette, and maybe even Edgar Allan Poe. So to walk us through it, there is no one I'd rather have do this with us tonight than tonight's guest. Just to introduce, many of you already know him, Jeff Steinberg. He spent decades digging into the history of American intelligence. He's a researcher, he's a writer, he's a historian, and he teaches classes at least 2 Florida universities. What I appreciate most about Jeff's work is that he goes past all the myths and into the primary sources, the letters, the reports, the paper trail, and he comes back with a story that's richer and stranger than any of the textbook versions. So Jeff, thanks for being here. I'm going to get out of your way. The floor is yours. Thanks so much for joining us tonight.
Well, it's a pleasure to be here, and I think you really did a great job of introducing the topic that we're going to be dealing with tonight. As you indicated, the United States won the American Revolution. The Treaty of Paris was signed in 1783, and at that moment, the country was still governed by the Articles of Confederation. There was no strong centralized federal government. It was a fairly loose coalition among 13 semi-sovereign states. It would not be until 1780 that we would establish a federal constitution. And one of the participants in that process, Benjamin Rush, at the end said, finally, we are truly a republic, because we needed a form of stronger government. But there was this deep resistance to a standing army, to the continuation of the kind of intelligence networks that we discussed in the first of these webinars in this series, which identified George Washington as the person who was singularly commanding a very extensive espionage network, spying on the British, spying on the Tories, the loyalists to Britain, and the role that those people played in some of the most important victories of the war. But in the aftermath of that, the institutions were shut down. In some cases, people who were spies during the revolution were protected. In some cases, their identities were not revealed for decades later. And so I'd like to switch over to the PowerPoint at this point and really go into the details of the story that we're going to be discussing. So what we're going to see is that while there was no formal government organization, maintaining an intelligence capability. And while we greatly reduced our standing army, networks that were private were formed immediately upon the completion of the American Revolution. And these institutions were very self-consciously dedicated to the idea of defending the Republic. It was clear that Britain and later other European powers, Napoleonic France among them, were committed to the idea that no Republican form of government should be allowed to establish a firm and durable precedent for that type of government, knowing that people in Europe and everywhere around the world would aspire to that if there was a clear and shining example of a successful form of government of the people, by the people, and for the people. And so the first of the institutions that was established, some of you may be familiar with it, perhaps some of the people who be viewing this are even members of it through their family lineages. But in 1783, the Society of the Cincinnati was established with the commitment to preserve and defend the ideals of the American Revolution. And the original organization was established as a military heredity order. Membership, we're going to see in a moment, was based on having served in the Continental Army for a period of time throughout the American Revolution. And it's very appropriate that the name that was chosen for this organization was Cincinnatus. Lucius Cincinnatus was a Roman Republic general who was a hero in defending the Republic, who was offered the opportunity to become dictator, and instead he shunned that and returned to his farming life afterwards. And it established this principle that's really part of the American military tradition of the citizen soldier. And so the Society of the Cincinnati was created under kind of very uncertain and harrowing circumstances to guarantee that there was a core group of people committed to defending the Republic. The motto of the society was he relinquished everything to serve the Republic. The building that you see there is Anderson House. It's located in downtown Washington, D.C. on Massachusetts Avenue. If you're familiar with that geography, it's pretty much catty corner across from the Cosmos Club. And it's the library, museum, and archive of the society, which still exists to this day because of its hereditary nature. The actual founding was May 13th, 1780 in Fishkill, New York, the home that was basically the home of Baron von Steuben, a German who had come over and had played a very important role as one of the key training officers for the American Continental Army during the Revolution. The initiative was taken by Henry Knox, one of the generals in the Continental Army, and the idea was to basically create a kind of line of communication for those people who had really dedicated their lives to the service of winning independence for the Republic. And the mission of the society was very clearly stated. George Washington was elected the first president general, and he served in that capacity until his death in 1790. The mission was to preserve the rights so dearly won, promote the continued union of the states, and assist members in need, their widows and their orphans. The first two of those missions of the society very much involved maintaining a vigilance, maintaining an intelligence capability, knowing what the adversaries, the opponents of the United States had in mind. And as you pointed out, we had largely disarmed and left ourselves vulnerable to the British efforts to recolonize, to reconquer in the War of 1812. And so the society played a continuing role, and at a certain point, they were pivotal to the effort to spread the American revolutionary ideas to Europe, which was both an expansion of those principles into other parts of the world, but also was part of the kind of security and defense of the United States by building up networks of people who were philosophical allies in many parts of the world. To be a member, you had to serve 3 years as an officer of the Continental Army or Navy, or have served in some capacity in the Army or Navy until the end of the war, or it was open to surviving relatives of those who died in combat. Again, you fought in the American Revolution. On July 4th, 1784, King Louis XVI of France formally ordained a French branch of the Society of the Cincinnati. It expanded very rapidly from the moment that the society was founded. Within the first year, 13 societies were set up in all 13 states. There were 5,500 approximately men who were eligible, and 2,150 became members in the first year. And as I say, Washington was elected the first president general.
Hey, Jeff, I got to say, that's really amazing. When you think about this, a French king charters a society of American Revolutionary officers.
Right.
What did Louis think he was getting, and what were the Americans actually building at that time?
Well, the French had allied with the Continental Army, with the Americans in the fight for independence. They played a rather important role, and Lafayette came back from America and was unquestionably the great hero among those in France who aspired to overcome the shackles of feudalism. And so I think that it was sort of a no-brainer that Lafayette would be considered a leading member of the society, and having gone back to France, he had a lot of influence to make this happen. Some of the other Europeans who were qualified for membership, the Comte de Rochambeau, who basically organized a covert French company to smuggle weapons and other military equipment to the Continental Army throughout the war. Von Steuben, who we mentioned, who came over and volunteered like Lafayette did and became a critical training officer, and Kosciuszko from Poland as well. So these were all some of the Europeans who went back to Europe or stayed in the U.S., but were inspired by these Republican ideas and the emerging Republican form of government, and hoped for the same thing for their own countries. They were patriots of their own countries, but firmly committed to the ideals of the American Revolution.
Yeah, it's amazing. You think about this, it's almost like a veterans fraternity, but,
Exactly.
in some extent, it sounds like they were undercover too.
Oh, there was a lot of that going on. Now, one of the really first important things that the society undertook, having served as officers during the American Revolution, they were painfully aware of the limitations of the Articles of Confederation. There was no process by which a centralized federal government could provide for the common defense. During the American Revolution, it was each state that provided the funding for the war. And so Hamilton and Madison, both members of the society, led the effort to launch an alternative to the Articles of Confederation to create a stronger federal constitution. They were instrumental in convincing the Congress to convene a convention in Annapolis, Maryland in 1786 to start the process of modifying the Articles. That convention was a flop. Very few states sent delegates, never got a quorum. But the ideas that Hamilton and Madison worked through for Annapolis set the stage for Congress approving a second attempt starting in May of 1787 in Philadelphia to draft modifications of the Articles. And so it happened that the second official meeting of the Society of the Cincinnati was scheduled to convene in Philadelphia starting May 1st, 1787. And Washington belatedly and somewhat reluctantly agreed to travel to Philadelphia, both for the Constitutional Convention as a delegate from Virginia and as the President General of the Society that was meeting in Philadelphia simultaneously. Not surprisingly, 23 of the 39 signers of the Constitution there throughout the spring, summer of 1787 in the sweltering heat, working through the details and forging a new federal constitution, were members of the Society of the Cincinnati. So in other words, a majority of the delegates who actually were there day in and day out were members of the Society of the Cincinnati.
So Jeff, let me ask you this. Are you saying that the society effectively engineered the Constitutional Convention?
You could say that, yes.
Wow.
Some historians might say it's a bit of an exaggeration, but there's no questioning that the members were among the most staunch of those committed to a stronger federal government. And so they were absolutely instrumental. And of course, after hours, after the meetings had been convened of the Constitutional Convention, people were staying at boarding houses, at the residences of various people. So there was a constant mix and interaction of discussion between the society members and all of the people participating in the Constitutional Convention. We think about September 1787 and the completion of the Constitution as end of the story, but there was strong anti-federalist opposition, and the ratification process itself was also very much led by leading members of the society, including Alexander Hamilton, John Jay, and James Madison. Remember that John Jay was the director of counterintelligence for the Continental Congress and was part of the secret committees of correspondence. And of course, Hamilton was the adjutant to George Washington, later served in combat at Yorktown. And so Jay and Madison and Hamilton were indispensable through the writing of the Federalist Papers, conveying most effectively the arguments that had carried the day in Philadelphia. And the Federalist Papers, while they were written for the New York ratification debate, were published in newspapers throughout the country in real time. And so they shaped the whole process of ratification. And of course, within the administration of George Washington, when he was elected president unanimously in the Electoral College, only time in history, and the only president to be elected without a party affiliation, the Washington cabinet, which was relatively small, had three leading members of the society: Henry Knox, Secretary of War, President George Washington, and Secretary of the Treasury Alexander Hamilton. And a fourth member, James Madison, was elected to the House of Representatives, but he simultaneously served as Washington's chief speechwriter. And so, for example, Madison drafted Washington's acceptance speech, then drafted the response by the House of Representatives, and then drafted Washington's response to the House. So it was a small, tightly knit group of members of the society who were in a critical position. We had the events of 1812 to 1815 when the White House was burned to the ground, when the British were defeated, but it was touch and go for a period of time as to whether or not the American Republic would survive. In the aftermath of the War of 1812, membership in the Society of the Cincinnati was extended to those who had similarly served in the Federal Army as officers during that period of the Second American Revolution, the defeat of the British for a second time in the War of 18. So, for example, one of the newer members of the society was General Winfield Scott, who would serve as a leading American figure in the military right up through the Mexican-American Wars. And so he becomes a kind of a continuity figure. After Washington's death, the presidency of the society was turned over to Alexander Hamilton until his death in the duel with Aaron Burr. In the aftermath of the War of 1812, the United States had survived that war. The economy was beginning to revive and prosper once again because Hamilton's First National Bank, whose charter had expired, was rechartered in 1816 for another 20-year period. And under the presidency of Francis Biddle, investments into infrastructure and expansion of the economy resumed. And so the United States was going through a kind of a recovery and expansion period in the aftermath of the war. At that time, a second generation of Republican intellectuals really came to the commitment to establish a unique and independent American culture, to really indicate that while there was a common language with Britain and common heritage that many Americans shared, a third or slightly under a half of the population in the United States during this period were from Germany and other parts of Europe outside of Britain, out of the United Kingdom. And so there was a commitment to establish a Republican culture in literature, in art, And some of the people who we're familiar with from that process were, in fact, also leading figures within this non-governmental but vitally important intelligence network. And so a number of the people whose names are quite well known, we're going to find had a critical role to play in these intelligence operations to defend the Republic. One of the critical people was James Fenimore Cooper. Cooper's father was a member of the Continental Congress. Many of you who've traveled up to the Baseball Hall of Fame up in Cooperstown, and Cooper was fascinated with the emergence of a U.S. Navy and Coast Guard. He wrote a number of histories of the Navy, but the first book that really got popular attention before he did his leather stocking tales about wilderness life was a book called The Spy. And The Spy was a novel, but it was based on the Revolutionary War espionage networks that we know genuinely existed and were pivotal in the victory. And his fictionalized account was based on the real life activities of a number of the spies who worked in the New York City area, trying to gather intelligence on what the British war plans were. And so in 1801, Cooper really was the first public figure to even tell the world about these espionage operations that were so vital to the victory of the American Revolution.
How does a novelist end up tied to all these old revolutionary spy rings? There's a thread there. It's really fascinating.
Well, his father was a member later of the U.S. Congress under the Constitution, and young James Fenimore Cooper was a very close friend of John Jay. Jay had gone on to become first the Attorney General and then the first Justice of the Supreme Court. And Jay knew the story from the inside and told Cooper the story, and Cooper, with permission, put it into the form of a very accurate historical novel. It's an extraordinary read. And, he talks about his literary term for it was the heroes of the middle ground who moved back and forth between Republican territory and enemy lines. And so that book, The Spy, earned him his first real big popular success as an author and established him as someone who was deeply embedded in these Republican networks and traditions. A year after that, he was the founder of the other overlapping and intersecting organization with the Society of Cincinnati, and that's the Bread and Cheese Clubs. They existed between 1822 and 1827. They would have monthly meetings, sometimes more frequently, at the Charles Wiley bookstore, which was also the publisher of Cooper's novels, and 35 major figures in American arts and sciences who were all dedicated to preserving a strong Republican form of government, were dedicated to these ideals and to creating a unique American artistic and literary culture, were part of this group. It was a tightly organized, very self-conscious network of people who considered themselves within the domain of literature and art to be revolutionaries. They looked at Sir Walter Scott as the sort of paradigm of European aristocratic promotion. Scott's novels talk about the virtues of the feudal era and presented a kind of aristocratic society in its best possible light by promoting hero figures, Ivanhoe and many others people are probably familiar with. But those characters did not convey these Republican values and virtues. They may have been heroic in other ways, but Cooper and the others really wanted to present an alternative. People may be familiar with the Hudson School of Art and painting these portraits of these beautiful, unending landscapes, conveying this idea of the vastness of the United States. And so these were all figures that were really actively living the life of Republican advocates, and many of them were in a very unique position to carry out critical intelligence work. William Cullen Bryant was one of the leading members of the Bread and Cheese Club, editor of the New York Review, editor of a newspaper founded by Alexander Hamilton called the New York Evening Post, today the New York Post. When Abraham Lincoln launched his presidential campaign in a famous speech at Cooper Union, Cullen Bryant introduced him and was a leading advocate of Lincoln's nomination for president. He was one of the people who organized the construction of Central Park in New York City and founded the Metropolitan Museum of Art. And so in this domain, he was one of the people that was extremely active. Washington Irving. He was the honorary chairman of the Bread and Cheese Club. People know him from the stories of Ichabod Crane and all of these things. But in addition to that, he was the biographer of George Washington. He wrote a comprehensive Knickerbocker Tales, which was a history of New York City from the Dutch period onward. He wrote a biography of Christopher Columbus, and he was the historian in English of the Moorish Renaissance that was in Spain for centuries. He visited and wrote about the Alhambra, one of the centers of this Moorish culture. And he was an American diplomat. And remember that American diplomats at this time were also responsible for intelligence. They were in Europe. They were there to know what was going on, to understand what the attitudes were towards this new upstart Republic United States. So he was secretary to the American legation in London in 1829. By 1842, after serving in London for a number of years, coming back to the U.S., he was made the minister to Spain, the U.S. ambassador to Spain. In his time back in New York City, he was founder of the New York Public Library, initially the Astor Library.
Yeah, I mean, it's really amazing when you think about it today. I mean, there's a line between diplomat and intelligence officer. Back then, obviously, there wasn't. Did they see a line between both of those roles?
No, in fact, the secret committees of correspondence that were carrying out the intelligence mission during the revolution in Europe were later renamed the Commission of Foreign Policy in the Second Continental Congress. And so during the revolution, the American diplomats, the ambassadors, and the consuls were the front line of American intelligence, recruiting agents, gathering information, using the opportunities afforded to diplomats, attending receptions and meeting with government officials. This was their bread and butter, was intelligence. In fact, to this day, the INR unit of the State Department, the Intelligence and Research section of the State Department, is one of the most important elements of our official intelligence community because of all of the diplomatic engagement and other activities that take place among the embassy staff. So that division is a lot less solid than even today it may appear to be. Samuel Morse, probably most everybody is familiar with him from Morse code, inventor of telegraphy. But Morse was also America's most prominent and famous portrait painter. He was trained by Benjamin West. He spent a number of years in England being trained by Benjamin West. And he did the portrait of John Adams when he sat as president. And we'll see the importance of the fact that he also painted the portrait of the Marquis de Lafayette that hangs in New York City Hall to this day. And so on his way back from Europe, where he was traveling around with James Fenimore Cooper, his closest friend, that was when he developed Morse code and finalized his ideas of a single wire telegraphy. 1824.
Let me ask you just a quick question. You know, it's interesting. How does a guy who invents Morse code, paints monarchs, give a man intelligence value? How does that happen?
And we're going to get to that in a second, because 1824 was a critical moment. We had a presidential election. John Quincy Adams, who had really defined and established American foreign policy, the principles of American foreign policy, was running for president. The Marquis de Lafayette visited the United States and was invited, among others, by the Society of the Cincinnati. And he spent the better part of a year and a half in the United States touring around. It played a very important role in reviving and revitalizing the sense of the drama and the heroics of the American Revolution. He traveled through all 13 states, was greeted with parades and banquets and delivered speeches. And the Society of the Cincinnati was the glue that organized this tour with the idea that this was, again, a moment to revitalize the ideals and the commitments of the American Revolution. There was a contest that was hosted by the New York City government to determine which painter would be commissioned to do the portrait of Lafayette that would be in City Hall. Not surprisingly, Morse won the contest. And Lafayette sat for the painting when he was a guest for a number of months of John Quincy Adams, having now been elected president and residing at the White House. And so Morse was there. Cooper, as one of the already most popular and well-known American writers, was invited to tour with Lafayette and to write a fictional, kind of quasi-fictional account of Lafayette's tour and his views of what he saw in the United States. Very reminiscent of de Tocqueville's Notes on American Democracy. But Lafayette also came with a mission. He was convinced that after the failure of the First French Revolution, the plunge into Jacobinism, the emergence of the Napoleonic dictatorship, his own exile and imprisonment, gotten out of jail through incredible efforts by John Adams, among others, that there was a new revolutionary ferment in Europe. And he wanted some Americans to come over there to participate in the process. And the two people who he solicited, the people who he had come to know during this visit to the United States, namely James Fenimore Cooper and Samuel Morse, both agreed to come back to France. And so in 1827, Cooper packed up his family and they all moved to Paris. He was there in France for 7 years, and that was his base, but he traveled all over Europe. Soon afterwards, his friend Samuel Morse arrived in France. Needless to say, both of them were in tremendous popular demand. Many European monarchs and other aristocrats, oligarchs, wanted to have Samuel Morse do their portrait. And so he was the proverbial fly on the wall for a lot of the business activities that were going on while these people were sitting for their portraits. It was a fairly common thing. What you see there on the screen is a portrait painting that Morse did. There's no such room at the Louvre, but having spent many hours almost every day there, Morse picked out what he thought were the most exquisite paintings there in the Louvre, and some that were not even there. Now you can see the Last Supper above the doorway. And so he spent months doing this incredible painting of all of these great artists' paintings that were there in the museum. And you can see that it's actually Cooper looking over his wife's shoulder in that picture right there. As I said, Lafayette was convinced that it was the time for revolution. The Bourbon monarchy had turned very ultra-conservative, and there were stirrings of revolt in Poland, in Greece, in Italy, and Lafayette founded the French-Polish Committee to support and encourage a revolution and an independent Poland, which had been under the Russian Empire at the time. And when Cooper and Morse arrived in Paris, they founded the parallel American-Polish Committee. And so they were openly involved with the major literary and artistic circles in Europe that were themselves leading figures in promoting this whole revolutionary idea. Cooper produced an extraordinary outpouring of intelligence material while traveling around Europe, using his fame as an American writer. He wrote a number of novels which were in-depth psychological and political profiles of the leading oligarchical institutions of Europe. He wrote a novel called The Bravo, which was about Venice. The Bravo was the assassin who worked for the Doge of Venice and the Committee of Three. And while Venice was nominally referred to as a republic, it was the exact opposite of the American ideals of what a republic was. The novel The Bravo, which was published around 1831, begins with a nonfiction introduction explaining the structures of government of Venice. He wrote a book book called The Heidenmauer, or The Benedictines, A Legend of the Rhine. Again, a profile in novel form of the societal structures, the aristocratic, feudal instruments of power in Germany. He wrote a number of reports, really comprehensive intelligence reports that were published from various places around Europe that he traveled to. They were called Gleanings from Europe. He wrote Gleanings of England, Gleanings of Italy, Gleanings of Germany. These were basically what we would today refer to as detailed country studies, looking at the history, the psychology. And so he was basically providing a treasure trove of intelligence on all of the European schemings against the American Republic. And these were coming back. They were being published as books, as series of articles, live reports from Europe by famous American writer. He was gleaning all kinds of intelligence coming from Morse, from all of his portrait painting work. And so basically you had an active network of American intelligence officers, private citizens with credentials as prominent artists, American diplomats. Remember, Washington Irving is in the British legation, then he's the ambassador to Spain. And so this whole network that initially came together in 1822 as members of the Bread and Cheese Club, committed to these ideals, were recruited by Lafayette to come to Europe to basically change the political face of Europe. In July of 1830, there was a second French Revolution. The Bourbons were kicked off of the throne. Lafayette was renamed as the head of the French National Guard at that time, and basically supported the transfer of power to a much more defined constitutional monarchy under the House of Orleans. During this period, Lafayette wrote back a letter that circulated in newspapers all over the United States, his letter to the American people. The march of liberty in Europe can perhaps be more or less thwarted, but the impetus is given, and our great week will bear its fruit in France and in all countries. Poland has taken a great part. It is superfluous to tell you that all my wishes and all my efforts will always be consecrated to the liberty of other countries to the full extent of my powers. So here's Lafayette, an older gentleman, a wealthy French aristocrat, but he's rekindled these Republican ideals that he experienced firsthand as a general in the Continental Army during the American Revolution. And he went back to the U.S. to bring up some younger generation revolutionaries, intelligent people, activists, literary and artistic figures to help move this process forward.
It's amazing, Jeff. Think about this. He's like an old war horse. He's looking back. Or is he coordinating a movement in real time?
I'd say, remember, he's still the head of the French branch of the European branch of the Society of the Cincinnati.
Yeah.
And so he's very much sworn to those principles of extending those ideals, defending the United States. And here, really, Cooper and Morse and Washington Irving, and we're going to see some others, were there carrying out exactly this mission, bringing it forward. Another figure who I think people are going to be rather shocked to find out more about him and his role in this same exact story is Edgar Allan Poe. And people, I can tell you, have a generally distorted view of Poe because one of his greatest enemies, competitors, rivals within the American literary field, a man named Rufus Griswold, clearly played a role in his murder and clearly moved immediately to purchase control over Poe's entire literary archive and wrote the eulogy to Poe when he died, his obituary, that was just completely full of lies. And those lies became the basis for the presumptions that Poe was a drug addict, borderline madman, kind of, half genius, half insane. We're going to see over the next few minutes that there's a very different story to be told about Edgar Allan Poe. It starts with the Society of the Cincinnati. Edgar Allan Poe's paternal grandfather was General David Poe, who was Lafayette's quartermaster during the American Revolution and was therefore qualified for membership in the Society of the Cincinnati. In fact, when Lafayette visited Baltimore upon his arrival in the United States in 1824, he went to visit his old war colleague, David Poe, but found out that Poe had passed away, but went with Poe's widow, Edgar Allan Poe's grandmother, to the gravesite. At that point, basically, Edgar Allan Poe's parents had both passed away. His father basically deserted the family. His mother and father were actors. They were traveling around. They did Shakespearean plays, other things. Almost months after Edgar Allan Poe was born, the father left. The mother died when Poe was very young, and he was adopted, fortunately, by a family from Richmond, a wealthy merchant family. Their last name was Allen. And so Edgar Allan Poe, named middle name after the family that adopted him, traveled extensively, spent several childhood years living in England, being educated, got a very fine education. And in 1824, he was a young man. He was 15 years old. He was living in Richmond, and he was the head of the local youth guard, the honor guard. And so he was at the head of the honor guard to greet Lafayette when Lafayette arrived in Richmond. There's no detailed documentation of the story, discussion that might have taken place. One can only speculate, but the fact is that that was Edgar Allan Poe qualified for membership in the Society of the Cincinnati. If you go to the Anderson House in Washington, you'll see David Poe's name listed among the people who qualified for membership. After briefly going to the University of Virginia, where he started some of his literary outpourings, Edgar Allan Poe joins the U.S. Army and spends several years in the U.S. Army. We don't know a great deal about his tenure, but the fact that we do know is highly suggestive of a very important role that he was chosen to play, because he was then offered a commission to attend West Point, and his sponsor into West Point was General Winfield Scott. And so Poe goes to West Point, and he's only there for a year or so. He's at the top of his class. There's all kinds of false accounts that he was a troublemaker, that he was a gambler, that he was using drugs, and all of these things that all derive from the hoax perpetrated by Rufus Griswold. But so after a year and a half, Poe leaves West Point, doesn't graduate, but when he leaves, he has a letter of recommendation from Sylvanus Thayer, the founding commandant of West Point, suggesting that he should be commissioned as an officer in the Polish army. And again, this is the period when Poland is revolting against the pogroms that were being administered by Russia, and where Lafayette is looking to Poland as one of the most likely places for revolution modeled on the American model to take place in Europe. So there you see Winfield Scott. That's a portrait of Sylvanus Thayer and a statue of him on the left there. But these are people who are among the most prominent military leaders in the country, among the most prestigious figures, and they all figure in this sort of process of moving Edgar Allan Poe along this path. Now, I think it's important to understand that Poe really is a genius. He's credited with developing, among the sort of uniquely American forms of literature, the detective novel. And the interesting thing is that his most famous detective novels all take place in Paris. The Purloined Letter, Murder in the Rue Morgue, several others. And these novels contain extremely detailed descriptions of the street life in Paris. But more importantly, they reveal a level of intellect and philosophical sophistication on Poe's part that he brings into his writing. So if people remember the Purloined Letter, it's about a minister in the French government who's holding a letter that is very devastating blackmail against other ministers. The police actually know that he's in possession of the letter. They've searched his offices, they've searched his residence, and they've been unable to find it. And so in desperation, they turn to Poe's character, Inspector Dupont, and ask him to go about finding the letter. And there's a section in the novel where Dupont is explaining to the police after he's recovered the letter how he found it. And he said, well, you all thought that this particular minister was merely a mathematician by training, and therefore you assumed that you could use mathematical logic and search his premises using, geometric squares and mathematical formulas, and that you'd find the letter. But what I understood is that he was not only a mathematician, but he was a poet. He understood metaphor. He understood the element of the unexpected, the surprise. And so Poe's character Dupin not only knows exactly where to find the letter, pretty much hidden in plain sight, but he also knows how to create the circumstances where he can get back into this man's residence and steal the letter, recover the letter. So it's worth reading. If you're going to read something, think about it when you're reading something by Poe about the mind of the author and the rigorous philosophical skill sets that he demonstrates. Now, there's a very famous debate that is still playing out to this day over the question of whether or not Edgar Allan Poe was ever in Paris. And again, through the intervention of Rufus Griswold, it's been largely said that he was not. But very interestingly, in December 15th, 1929, the New York Times published an article. And the headline of the article was, Poe visited Paris. Dumas script says. Newly found document tells of writer's trip to the scene of his detective tales. Notes his strange habits. American living in home of French novelist insists on keeping rooms dark. The article basically reports that an American rare books buyer from New York City was traveling around Europe and purchased a manuscript by the French writer Alexandre Dumas, who was a famous writer, wrote about the revolutionary ideas in France, who also happened to be an officer in the French National Guard under Lafayette in the early 1830s when these revolutionary events were happening. And he was very close in the literary circles with both Cooper and Morse. So you're looking at this Republican network that was basically under the general patronage of Lafayette. And so this manuscript is found in 1929, and basically the New York Times quotes from a section of Dumas' manuscript where he says, and this is quotes from Dumas, it was about the year 1832. One day, a young American presented himself at my house with an introduction from his fellow countryman, the famous novelist Fenimore Cooper. Needless to say, I welcomed him with open arms. His name was Edgar Poe. From the outset, I realized that I had to deal with a remarkable man. 2 or 3 remarks which he made on my furniture, the things I had about me, the way my articles of everyday use were strewn about the room, and on my moral and intellectual characteristics impressed me with their accuracy and truth. So the letter, the manuscript goes on for quite a long description about how Dumas invited Poe to stay with him and how Poe was completely nocturnal. He had window coverings so that he could write and sleep during the day, but at night after dark, he traveled the streets of Paris. Dumas often traveled with him. And again, he was carrying with him the letter from Sylvanus Thayer proposing that he should be commissioned as an officer in the Polish army. Think of this as more of a holograph than a completely filled out picture. But we know for certain that Cooper and Morse were brought to France to help Lafayette to organize revolutions in Europe and to carry out intelligence and counterintelligence work to keep the American government one step ahead of the intrigues that were still going on in Europe. In fact, Morse came back and wrote a book called The Conspiracies Against the Independence of the United States, which was his account of things that he encountered in his travels around Europe doing these portrait paintings. Poe was back in the United States. We don't know if he was in Poland. I think there's very strong reason to believe that it's absolutely true that he was in France, that he was there engaged with Cooper and Morse and the others, and Lafayette, who again he encountered in 1824 in Richmond, Virginia. And so again, it's something that requires a great deal more in-depth historical work, but the basic outlines are are there. Between the Society of the Cincinnati, the Bread and Cheese Clubs, these networks were committed to doing the intelligence work that had been carried out during the American Revolution, but which was no longer being conducted by formal organizations of government. We would not have an official non-wartime intelligence agency in the United States, except for the Secret Service to protect diplomats and the president, until the 1880s, when first naval intelligence was officially established. So these private, devout, dedicated Republican figures organized into these networks and carried out these operations. Poe's other claim to fame, in addition to being a famous poet and writer of short stories, detective novels, and other literature, he was also one of the most talented code breakers. And one of the things that Poe did was he had a column in several newspapers around the country challenging people to present codes to him, which he would then, in the next issue of the newspaper, break the code, show how he broke it. And there's a report, which I find credible, although not fully confirmed, that some of Poe's colleagues knew the identity of the British naval intelligence head in Washington, D.C., and sort of cultivated a friendship, a barroom friendship with him, got him drunk one night and said, there's this guy who writes these code breaking things in the newspapers, and why don't you anonymously send the British naval codes and you'll, see whether or not they're broken or not. And so he was sort of cajoled into doing it, and Poe received the codes, broke them, and basically he only knew by the identification, the code name, the pseudonym that the writer sent the codes in with, that was what he was getting. So he was involved in all of these kinds of intrigues, and again was part of this effort to create a uniquely American school of literature to be part of a uniquely American culture. In 1849, shortly after turning 40 years old, Edgar Allan Poe was traveling from Richmond through Baltimore to New York because he had been told that there was a wealthy individual who was prepared to invest money in creating a literary magazine that Poe would be the editor-in-chief of. He had done a number of other magazines, but never had 100% control over the editorial policies. And he stopped off in Baltimore, Maryland, and was found mortally wounded and died several days later. He was found wearing not the clothes that he had on the train, but scraps of clothing. He was made to look completely disheveled and degenerate. He was beaten to an inch of his life and then died several days later. And Griswold wrote the official obituary that appeared in all of the newspapers, raced to Baltimore and gave a sizable sum of money to Poe's living relatives who were poor, his aunt, who had all of his papers, and Griswold scooped up all of his papers. Was known years later for having forged many things, burned a lot of material, and so it's only based on the Griswold fabrications that there are denials that Poe was in France in 1831-32. But years after Poe's death, Dr. John Moran, the attending physician, wrote an entire book called A Defense of Edgar Allan Poe, The Life and Character and Dying Declarations of the Poet, in which he said Poe was followed from the train, was mugged in an alleyway, and Moran said that he received this detailed account from Poe, that Poe was lucid right up until the final fatal moments. And so many elements of Poe's life, as with some of the more detailed accounts of what Cooper and Morse and Washington Irving were doing during this incredibly important period of learning what the Europeans were plotting against the U.S. Of course, ultimately, that came to fruition with the Civil War, which the British and French played a decisive role in promoting separation, the secession, and the preservation of slavery. So these networks filled a critical gap during the period where we really had no official intelligence services that were assigned the responsibilities to defend the Republic against enemies, foreign and domestic. And this is just one sort of snapshot of the kinds of networks and institutions that were formed to fill that vacuum until we really reached the point as a sovereign nation where we felt the necessity and the confidence to establish permanent institutions, military and intelligence-wise, that would not jeopardize the existence of our democratic federal republic.
That's amazing, Jeff. But Jeff, let me ask you this. These men, all of them, they risked their reputation, their fortunes, their safety for a cause that really didn't have any official sanction at all, no guarantee of thanks. So what does that say about their character? And then if you're a listener to this, what's one lesson from these people about serving something larger than themselves that you think that we can take away?
We're a country in which sovereignty derives from the people. I've joked with people in some of my classes that it's unconstitutional for any individual citizen to be uninformed about the politics of the moment, to not be fully qualified to choose our elected representatives, and to be prepared to step into whatever is required to preserve our republic. The Pledge of Allegiance was drafted in the middle of the 1800s. It was drafted to commemorate Columbus's discovery of America, but it became our formal Pledge of Allegiance. The official language was finalized in the 1920s. President Eisenhower added 2 words, under God, in the 1950s in the height of the battle against global communism. But prior to that, it was one nation, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. That under God was kind of an added punctuation mark for the 1950s. But that means that just as every military officer, every elected official of government swears an oath to the Constitution, we do it, on a regular basis when we pledge our allegiance to our republic.
Jeff,
I think it's the message to derive for everybody.
It's really fascinating. A reminder to everybody who's online, drop your questions into the Q&A panel. I'll read them out for Jeff to answer. But when you think about this, what's one source or document that you wish more people knew about?
Well, I think the whole process of the Constitution.
Yeah.
In 1970, during the bicentennial celebration, the Bicentennial Commission commissioned a history of the Constitution. It's a book called Miracle at Philadelphia. And if there's one thing to read, if you're not going to sort of plunge into this and read the Constitution and those things, that book is extraordinarily important. There was a history that came out just a few years ago by a woman named Pauline Meyer up at Yale, which was a history of the ratification process, which had never been assembled before in one book. This was courtesy of the Historical Society of Wisconsin assembling volumes and volumes of the documentation of all 13 of the ratification debates. This was the most broad-based, profound political debate in human history, in my view. So these are the things I think that would be most valuable to really reinvigorate that sense of citizenship and responsibility.
Yeah. Well, Jeff, here's a question from the audience. They said, you call 1812 to 1815 the Second American Revolution. How does that reset the stakes for the generation that comes next?
Well, it was a very clear reminder that despite the large gaps, the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans, that we still had serious adversaries that wished us ill will and wanted to break up the republic. And so I think for the generations that came into their own during that period and in the decade after that, there was an increased sense of responsibility for doing whatever was possible. We're given talents, how to use those talents to defend the republic. And so, 1783, we had the Society of the Cincinnati, and they were clearly, even in their charter, committed to the idea that they've got to defend the republic. So it was not a formal government organization, but it was pretty close to it. And then Cooper and the others who were really instilled, they were the second generation. Their parents were the revolution. And so they had a kind of an inherited sense of responsibility. And, under other circumstances, in the aftermath of World War II, they might have joined the CIA or gone into military intelligence or something like that. In this case, they created an organization that, in a more obviously limited way, served that vital function to help preserve the republic.
Really amazing, spectacular, actually. Well, Jeff, this has been really rich, and so many things that I wasn't even aware about. Just incidentally, when I worked at the White House, one of the things I would love to do is take people through, the West Wing and through the White House. But one of my favorite places to go was actually on the outside, right below the I was kind of in the basement, and if you can actually see when the British burned down the White House, you can still see the marks of smoke that are still there. And it really is, that's kind of one of the last, vestiges of that chapter, and I think, oh, by the way, Dolly Madison took the portrait of Washington out of the East Wing of the White House, I think, if I'm not mistaken. So it was really.
Yeah. John, you took me on that tour, I think the first night we met.
Yes, I remember that. I was going to say, I think, Jeff, you were on that tour, but did you remember seeing the smoke marks up there?
Absolutely. You pointed them out. Yeah.
Pretty cool. If you go to the old Abbott Grill right over there in the corner, that's where the British watched the White House burn. So
exactly. Yeah.
Well, Jeff, here's what I'll take from tonight. When the institutions step back, individuals step forward, not with titles or budgets, as you said, but with character and nerve. So you had a novelist and a painter, an old French general, a circle of writers. They carried Republic's secret work because someone had to do it, and they were the ones who were willing to do it. And that's about as pure as Heroes Path's story as I can come up with. And very grateful for you telling the story. We were talking before we actually came on air here that this is just part 2 of the series, The Untold Story of U.S. Intelligence. And I asked you, how many do we have? And how many do we have, Jeff, all told?
Somewhere between 6 and 8, depending on how we break up the time.
Yeah, we're just at the beginning, and this is fascinating and very grateful. Everything lives here on Heroes Path, and you'll be able to actually go to our website very soon. It's going to be heroespathfoundation.org, and you'll see all the webinars there. If you want to join as a member, you'll be able to go through our full curriculum. All that's coming up very shortly. So very grateful for everybody's support and joining us here at The Creation, as they say. Tonight's recording is going to go out to everybody who registered, and we'll post it on all of our social media venues as well. But please do share this with someone who'd love to watch it. And if you're not on the list, just register so you don't miss what's next. And we're going to be doing this again, probably, I think, Jeff, we can maybe in August, if that works. So, Jeff, thank you again. For everyone, thank you for spending your evening with us, and good night.
Good night.
Bye-bye. All right, Jeff, that was great.
Yeah, fascinating story, isn't it?
Yeah, really, really fascinating. And Daryl, thanks very much for joining us on this as well. These are great stories, and a lot of it we don't know about. I think, if I'm not mistaken, Edgar Allan Poe is buried in Baltimore, isn't he? Yeah.
Yeah, there's a Poe house in Philadelphia. I think there's one in Richmond. Those were his 3. And then he lived in New York City for a while. So there's 4 locations where he lived that are national historical sites.
Didn't they just do a movie or a series about him up at West Point or something like that? He was investigating something?
Yeah, there's a movie called something like The Blue-Eyed Cadet or something like that.
Yeah.
It's on Netflix. So we watched it. Michelle and I were talking about it earlier today. We saw it about 6 months ago. We got to go watch it again.
What a fascinating guy. So why did this guy ruin his reputation? What was the bad blood that they had between them?
I really think that there was more behind it. I don't think that Griswold had the bandwidth to be able to deploy a bunch of hooligans to follow him and kill him. I think it's the bigger issues. It's the Republic versus the enemies of the Republic. And it's a whole dimension of that final moment of Poe's life that is unclear. I mean, Griswold was a conniving, hated character. He tried to claim dominance over literature. He published anthologies of other people's poetry and was resentful that Poe was so vastly superior as a writer and poet. So there was personal elements, but that's never the full story.
Yeah, well, so it also sounds like Poe got too close to the sun.
Exactly right. I think that's exactly it.
Yeah.
And so then the question is, who was the son that felt threatened?
Yeah. Well, just really fascinating, Jeff. Thanks so much. And for everybody joining us, really just good to be with you. And we'll do this again next month.
I'll talk to you soon then. Okay.
All right. Take care, Jeff. Bye-bye now.